This will be our first Photoshop tutorial. We're only going to have two. I'll try to teach you as much as I can in this week's tutorial and next week's tutorial, but I'll give you enough tools so that you're able to successfully complete our second project. We're creating a photo montage project. This is going to give you an introduction to using the software, but also we're thinking about how to critically combine images to communicate meaning and to communicate concepts and ideas. Now, these ideas or concepts can be as simple as creating a dynamic abstract composition that allows the viewer to interpret their own meaning, or it can be as didactic as something like Barbara Kruger's work from the lecture. Make sure you're watching the lectures, not just skipping ahead to the tutorials. It will be rather clear to me who has been watching them and who has not based on the quality of the assignments that you submit for your projects. So here we are in Photoshop. I do want to show you, this is just their kind of landing screen when you open the software. You can click Learn over here, and we have a ton of tutorials that you are welcome. Photoshop or Adobe creates pretty great tutorials for all of their software, so you can really jump into any of these as a kind of backup tutorials to the one I'm going to be providing you today. So when I start Photoshop, I'm just going to go and say I'm going to create a new page. And for our project, we are doing an 11 by 17 work. So something that you would print on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, enough room for you to bring a bunch of elements together. And the size also ensures that we're using high quality images, preferably images that you've taken yourself, although you can mine the internet for your images, but just know that the quality might be kind of low. So what we'll have here is whenever I say create new, I have some presets here on the right. And I can then also just fill in, there's presets here, right? And there might be an 11 by 17. A lot of these are my custom presets from things that I've done. Or I can go here, print, maybe we'll have an 11 by 17 here, tabloid, 11 by 17 at 300 ppi. So we could type it in here, or I can click tablet. I can go up to the top here for new document and say print, and then choose this. I can choose here the orientation, but this is something that I can also switch later on. But we do want to be working at a 300 resolution DPI or PPI, pixels per inch. And this is important for anything that we are going to print. We're not necessarily going to print these, but if we were to print them, this is the size, this is the resolution that you need to print at. Okay, the color mode here, I might say 16-bit, 8-bit's fine. And I'm just going to say create. So now I have a portrait size. I can choose between portrait or landscape. Right now I'm oriented in portrait mode, and that's fine. I'm going to go to window up here, and I've shown you this, I think, in my very first like how to resize an image tutorial. I can say my workspace, this is my workspace, mine, because I use just very few tools here that Photoshop has to offer, but for our sake, we'll just go to the Essentials default, which gives us, it's just too much, I think, actually. I don't like this. I don't need this Learn tab. So the default is not my favorite. Let's see, maybe photography. And photography might work, but I'm gonna go ahead and let's start with the Essentials default, and then let's go and close the tab group for Learn and close the tab group for Libraries and just collapse that. So now this looks pretty similar to the workspace that I had, except we have this Properties tab, which might come in handy. Now we have all of our tools to the left. I have my main toolbar at the top. This allows me to save and also access a bunch of other tools. And then I have this second bar here shows me the different options for the different tools that I have available. When you hover over any of these, you see what the tool is, and then it tells you its hotkey. So this is a W if you want to use the magic wand tool. The crop tool is C, and etc. down the line. Wherever you see this little caret, that means that if you click on this, there are more tools embedded in that icon. So the gradient tool also gives us the paint bucket tool, and then this 3D material drop tool, which we don't have to worry about. At the very bottom, I have my color picker. Right now it's kind of black and white, and I do wonder, right, okay, so we are working with color. So if I go to my color tab here and I select from my color selector, that's going to change. It's going to give me my top color. It's going to change the foreground color, and then I can switch that to the background color. I can also click directly on the icon, and this will allow me to choose. This has an interesting kind of color picker. We can choose our color here and say, okay. I can click on the foreground or the background and change my foreground and background colors like that. Or whatever is, this will always choose the foreground color if I work with this color selector tab here, okay? So I have, this is the gradient tool, which I don't need. I'll go back to my select tool. And we've already dived into this a little bit, but we can go here to our image size. And this will give us our specs on our image size. I can change this to inches, right? And I can, if I want to change the orientation of this, I can say image rotation and maybe rotate it. And so now I'm working in landscape mode. This gives us an opportunity to work kind of left to right as we read an image like a book from left to right. I like this format because it really forces you to choose a particular compositional orientation. So let's bring in some, what we're really going to do is start to work with layers, because that's what Photoshop is really, what's the most powerful component about Photoshop is what we're doing is we're going to be layering images together, and then we can manipulate each of those layers to combine them into a final image. So what I can do here in my layers panel is I can add a layer using this button. Let me make this full screen here. Let me add a layer. And now you see that I have a layer with this checker box that's highlighted, layer 1. I can click here and I can rename it if I want. I have the background layer. The background layer is locked. I can click on it and unlock it, and now this turns it into layer 0. The background is by default white, but I can also now here turn this off, and you'll see that layer 1 is, this means that it's transparent. So meaning that anything that you add to this will have a transparency anywhere but where the image is. So this allows you to kind of stack them together. It's almost like we're placing these different components on planes of glass and stacking them on top of each other. If I want to delete a layer, I can go ahead and click this little trash can. And once I've unlocked that background, now I can just have this blank transparent sheet that I'm working with. There are other options here, and I'll get into those in a little bit. What I'd like to do now is import some images into my composition. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to say Place Embedded. And now what I've done is in my Documents folder, I've created a folder for Core 3 and for Photoshop Tutorial. And this is where I'll save my image. I'll save it into this folder, just so I have all my source imagery and then my Photoshop project all in the same space on my computer. This is really important, because if you start pulling things and they're in your downloads folder, and then you delete some things and you don't know where they are, then we're going to have an issue. You want to always have everything kind of in one place so you can refer back to it. So I'll just choose this and I'll say place, this first image. And now it's going to bring this in to my layer. And I have the option here. The first thing I'm going to want to do is resize this image. And if I hit this, and it's because you see we have these transform options here. And if I click inside the image, I can move it. And if I click any of these little squares, I can resize the image. If I hit the Shift key, it will unlock the aspect ratio. So I can really manipulate the width and height ratio. but if I just click and drag, it will maintain that ratio. Once I'm done, I can double click in the image. Command Z will undo. Let me show you that again. Go say place embedded, and then again do this, right? Or I can hit this check box at the top. So now I've placed this. I'm going to do that with a couple more images. You see here now that I have this, this icon's changed, and this is a place image icon. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and I'm going to place embedded another image that I've taken. Okay, and maybe one more. What I want to do is create a new layer. Okay. All right, so now I have 3 images to work with. The first thing I want to show you with layers is that the top layer, the layers appear in order here. So the bottom layer in your layer menu or your layer window here is going to be the one that's on the top in your composition. I can drag, I can hold and drag, and you see that little blue line, and now I can reorder these layers. Okay. Another thing I can do with my layer tab is, and depending on which layer is selected, that's the one I'm working with, I can change the opacity of that layer. Okay. And then there's something else interesting here is that I can create an adjustment layer, which I think I'll get into a little bit later. Let me get into how to manipulate some of these images first before we jump into other types of layers. So that's the way I can place these, place my images directly into my scene, or into my composition rather. And if I want to rescale any of these after I've placed them in, then I just want to make sure that I'm selected in the layer tab. The other thing here is that with our select tool, you see there's auto select, click checked on. That means that, and you can see this in the layers tab, that any image, any part of a layer that I've clicked on, then it will select that layer. If I turn this off, then I'm only able to select, it doesn't matter where I click in my scene, it will always just let me select that. It will only let me select that layer. So auto select on or off can be useful. So now what I'll do is, let's say I want to rescale. Let's add another layer. Let's embed another image here. Place embed, and maybe this one. And maybe I want this. Let's just double click on it. Now, if I want to rescale this, let me change its opacity because I think that looks kind of nice. Let me go ahead and if I'm selecting that layer, I can say edit and free transform, or I can go to transform and select just one particular way I want to transform it. This allows me to rotate. I can rotate one of the images in my composition. I can flip it horizontal or vertical. I can warp it, scale it, rotate it, or I can go with free transform, and that allows me to rotate. If I hit shift, I will be rotating it at standard degrees. So I'm able to rotate, and then I'm able to rescale. So if I want to, let's say, snap these to the sides of my composition, then I can do that. So that's how I'm able to rescale an image after I've placed it, or change its rotation, or manipulate it that way. So scale or rotate. So let me show you some of the other tools here and just go over what they are. These are our selection tools. These selection tools allow us to select part of a layer in different ways. We'll get into that maybe next week. This allows us, this crop tool will allow us to crop the entire image, which is not something that we're going to do since this is the size paper that we want. This is the size paper or canvas or whatever we want to be working with. The eyedropper tool allows you to choose a color And you can see it here. It's been selected in my foreground color. So that's a way that I can, using this eyedropper tool, I can select a color from my composition. And then we have other things, the patch tool. This is the brush tool. See, and the brush tool, if I have one of these embedded image or place embedded layers, I have to rasterize it first, which means that right now this is a smart object, meaning that it's retaining all of its image information, even if I scale it down. Once I rasterize it, it means that now it's kind of permanently that size, that scale, and the resolution of this image. So I'm not going to do that right now. What I'll do is maybe add another layer. And now I can use my brush tool. So the brush tool is, here's all of our parameters up here that we can change. We can change the opacity of our brush, its flow, how smooth it is, etc. But if we drop down here, the most important thing is the size and the hardness. So right now, it's a very soft brush. And then there are some presets that we can scroll through. So a hard, round, pressure, soft. So this one has opacity changed. And so there's a bunch of presets here for different brushes we can work with. But for now, we'll just go with soft, round. And here's our size. We can manually increase it, or we can type it in and numerically increase it. Another way to increase the size of your brush, and it's not just for the brush tool, there are other tools here that use a brush, but if we use our brackets, our angle brackets, they're the two that are next to the P on your keyboard. If you press the right angle bracket, it'll make the brush bigger, and the left angle bracket make the brush smaller. And now I can use my brush tool to, if I hit shift, I can draw a straight line. And now I can kind of paint in a color on this layer. Something else I didn't show you about layers here, we can lock any layer that we want. If we don't want to manipulate or we don't want to be able to mess with it, we can lock it. Also, we have these little eyeballs here. You can hide or make visible any of the layers as you'd like. Okay. Then things like the clone stamp we'll get into. This is the erase tool, pretty standard. I can just erase part of my, right? I can erase, and then I also have here with the erase is also kind of brush, and it has a size and a hardness to it. The hardness says the edges of the brush. If there's a kind of feathered transition, or if it has a kind of sharp line to it, sharp edge. Gradient tool, and then these are some, or this is the blur tool. Let's get into blur tool a little bit here. Let me go to this image here, and I have to now rasterize this if I want to be able to use any of these tools. The blur tool, and let's actually first use the zoom tool, which is at the very bottom. Let's zoom in, and I'll show you what the blur tool does. The blur tool, again, works with a brush, so I can change the size by going up here, or I can use my angle brackets, okay, to make the brush bigger. And then blur, the strength is 100%, but you can start to see how I'm blurring the pixels of this image. And you can see based the kind of sharp focus here on this little petal or this part of the plant, and then here it's much softer. That's what blur tool does, pretty simple tool. Then I have the sponge tool, and embedded in the sponge tool, I have a number of tools that are based on photographic tools that you might find in a darkroom. Burn and dodge are both darkroom techniques, but the sponge tool desaturates part of the image. And you can see here that it's losing its color values as I'm desaturating it. The flow is 50% here. And desaturate. So this will eventually become like a grayscale image. in the parts that I'm using this saturation tool. So I can desaturate, or here are the mode I could saturate. So let's start to saturate this comparatively. And so now this tool will make this a lot brighter and more vibrant and saturate that part of the image. The burn tool means that you make that part of the image darker. Burning is a technique that when you are in the dark room and you're turning a negative into a photograph, because what you do is you put the negative in a plate and then you expose that negative for a period of time onto the photosensitized paper. You can use something that has a little hole in it to make part of the image darker in order to bring out the contrast of that one particular place, or which is why you see this hand, because usually photographers might use their hand and kind of hover their hand over that part of the image so that the little hole that your hand makes will expose that part of the photograph and making the photograph itself darker in that one particular area. And then there's dodge, which was a little kind of piece of paper that's attached to a little wire, and the dodge will make an area lighter as you expose the negative to the film. So here you can see those techniques where if I use the dodge, it will brighten that area of the photograph. And then if I use the burn tool, it will darken that area. And you can change whether we're using darkening or lightening, shadows, midtones, or highlights. Okay, we have some tools that we're not going to be using. Pen tool, which is a vector-based drawing tool, and then a text tool. You can use text if you'd like Barbara Kruger style, but I wouldn't really recommend it. I think it's too simple. I think it's too easy to convey meaning through text, and if you don't do it artfully and you don't do it really thoughtfully, then it's going to become way too didactic and really shut us off. I think Barbara Kruger does didactic work really cleverly, where it's just red, white, black, simple, in your face message. But I think with this project, don't use any text. If you wanted to use text though, you have the options here on how to change the size and the font and everything. We have a shape tool, not going to get into this. This hand tool allows you to, if you are zoomed in, this is the zoom tool. The hand lets you pan around your image if you're zoomed into it. And then we have the zoom tool. I can hit Option on my keyboard, and that's zoom out, or I can zoom in. I can also click here to zoom out or zoom in. There's also down here, it tells us we can change what percentage we're zoomed, or we can also go and let's see where it is. View. Under view, we have zoom out, zoom in, and then we can say fit on screen, which will change the size of our little viewport here, to the size of our composition to the size of this, to our screen in this particular viewport. Now I did make text and I deleted it, but I do have a text layer here now in my layer list. So let me go ahead and delete that. So I just have my images. And because I had been manipulating this particular image with the dodge and burn tool, now this image no longer has this little icon embedded next to it. Okay, so let's see, what else do I want to show you today? Let's go to image here, and let me, I showed you how to kind of, using the brush, adjust things like brightness or saturation, using those dodge and burn tools, but we can do it overall to the, let me turn up the opacity here on this image. I can do it overall by going to image adjustments, and then I have a number of adjustments that I can make to a particular layer. And so I can go to brightness contrast here, and this will allow me to increase the brightness, decrease it, increase the contrast, or decrease it. Really here what I've added now is a smart filter. So I'm able to go back. This is what the smart object does, is it keeps a record of the history of your manipulations and modifications to the image. So you can go back in time and take something and redo it if you don't like it. Go back to image here and say image adjustments, and I can let's work here with levels for a second. This is a more refined way to deal with the contrast and the brightness. So we have our levels, our brightest spots in the photograph, and then our darkest spots, and then a midtone. So changing the midtone value does exactly what that brightness contrast does. But I can also, let's say I have a photograph that's too dark, I can adjust its where the white is, and so I can adjust which part of the image. You'll see, well, this is called a histogram. And if you have a photograph that's not balanced well, you can adjust it by adjusting where black resides along the histogram and where white resides. So go ahead and say cancel there. And then an even more refined way to adjust brightness and contrast is with curves. And this is something that you can actually use too. This doesn't do it in a kind of linear way. This allows you to manipulate the histogram using curves. And so you can get some kind of interesting inversions and stuff happening using curves. So this is all these channels. And then we also just have the red, green, and blue channel that you're able to manipulate. So I'll go ahead and keep that. But again, I can turn that on or off if I would like to change, if I'd like to go back a step, but I still want to keep that as an option for myself, but I can turn that off if I'd like. Okay. So I can go back to adjustments here. I have things like vibrance. I like hue saturation. This allows me to saturate or desaturate the image. And then I can adjust its hue, meaning that, let's cancel this, hit cancel. And maybe I'll work with, let's turn off these layers and work with this layer here, this piece of grass. This is a close-up of a piece of grass. So I'll go here and say hue saturation, and I can adjust the hue values of this and really start to change. So it's taking, it's basically shifting. You can see at the bottom that it's shifting the spectrum and where it lies. So I'm able to adjust the color values and really radically change them. And then I have things like invert, which will invert the color palette of that image. And so here I also have this now image has its own smart filter, invert and hue saturation. So the last thing I just want to show you quickly for this tutorial is using adjustment layers. I have this top layer here. Let me turn on all my layers. I'll delete this layer. Oh no, there's something in it. There's the brushwork there. Okay, fine. So I have these things called adjustment layers, and that's what this little icon is here. And it allows me to add a filter based on those adjustments that we just used. So we have those adjustments that we can use just to particular layers. Also, if we use the select tools, which I'll show you next week, when we use the select tools, then we can manipulate just that one particular selection. But here what I'll do is I will add a curves adjustment layer. And what the adjustment layer does is it will manipulate those values based on whatever I've adjusted here to all of the layers in my layer list. So we can see what this will look like. So now I'm adjusting the curves here. And if I drop this, let's say below this, now it's only adjusting the curves of the layers that are below it, right? So here I'm just adjusting. So when it's placed at the top, we can also see that this little frame I've created with that brush is adjusted. But if I don't want that to be manipulated, then I can place it below that layer. And now just the images below it have been adjusted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say File, Save As. And I want to save this as a Photoshop file. And I am going to save it in my Photoshop tutorial file folder, but you should name your folder Core 3, Project 2 perhaps. We want to maintain our layers, and we want to save it as a Photoshop file. Eventually, when we're finished, we're going to flatten it. We're going to save it as a JPEG. But for now, save it as Photoshop. And I'm going to say project to demo. Okay, and that will do it for this week. What I would do is I would recommend for this week, compile all of the source images that you want to use for your project. You know what I'll do quickly before we go? Let me give you a quick tidbit. If you're going to pull some images from the internet, what I don't want to see, I don't want to see any watermarks on any of your projects. Don't ever do that, please. Do not pull anything that has a watermark on it. Okay, so I'm going to search for flowers in Google Images. And then I want to go to settings, or excuse me, tools, and I want to choose size and say large. What I can do is if I hover over these images, or I click on them, I think, right? So I have these images of flowers. I prefer the ones that I've taken myself. I think that they will make for a much more interesting composition if you use your own photographs. So go out, shoot, look at your archive from project one and see if there's anything there that you want to pull together. But let's say I want to pull something from Google search. Somebody honking their horn outside, sorry. Let's say I like this image. It'll tell me its size, which is 1280 by 720. Let's just see how large this is, right? So I can click on it, find that image, or even here on my image search, I right click and I say save image as, and I'll save it into my, I'll just say flower one. This is a ping. So let's see how large that is compared to our composition, right? So it's only 1280. That's going to come up to here by 720. And that's a pretty large image for something to be found on the internet. Again, I'll say file, embed image, place image, or excuse me, place embedded, and then place this. And now you can see that it's placing. So what it'll do, whenever I use place embedded, it will stretch it to be the size of the composition, the canvas. But you can see just how pixelated this image is. So unless you are, right, and so really at 1280 by 720, it's about that big. So pulling images from the internet, I really wouldn't recommend it. I would take your own photographs and use those to develop your composition. Pull photographs that you've taken in the past. But if you want to find photographs online, then just know that the best way to do that is to make sure that they're a really high resolution or really high large file size, and you can at least filter out some of your options by going to tools and saying what size large. Okay, that does it for this week. Collect images, start to place them in your composition, and next week we'll learn how to manipulate those images even further.